Please join me in welcoming K.T. McFarland.
That's about the nicest introduction I've had in a long time. Thank you very much. Michelle and I were colleagues in the Reagan administration when the good old golden days, right? One of the things that I thought I would say is a little bit more, not that you need to know more about me, but the important thing I think, especially in talking to a women's group, is I was a stay-at-home mom for 20 years. I did work in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations. I was the highest-ranking woman at the Pentagon, on the cover of Washingtonian magazine, going to be the first woman Secretary of State. And then once we won the Cold War in the late 1980s, I serendipitously met a great guy, got married, moved to New York, and stayed home to raise 5 kids. And I then, after September 11th, when we lost a lot of friends in New York, and particularly children of good friends, I figured if somebody's bombing my city and killing our kids, I'm back in the fight. So I got back involved in politics. And my message to any woman, and I've got to tell you, as Michelle and I know from our period in government, and Bridget as well, there would never have been a room full of young professional women who were other than secretaries. And the fact that you can get tens and 20s and hundreds and thousands of young women today just warms my heart, because I was always the only one. And it's so terrific to see, especially as a mother of 2 daughters who are about your age. So you've got a great future ahead of you, and just seize it, because it's never going to happen again, and particularly at this moment in American history. What I did want to talk to you first, what I'd like to do is I'll talk to you about what I know best, which is foreign policy stuff, and talk to you about what I see are the flashpoints of the world in the next year, and then leave a lot of time for questions. And you can ask me about everything from, I guess, toilet training to to Iran's nuclear weapons program. I can handle them all. Right now, we're entering an era where for the next year, I think there are going to be 3 flashpoints to watch out for. 3 flashpoints that affect us. There'll be other things going on in the world, but the 3 that are going to affect the United States the most are the Arab Spring. Now, it was heralded with great enthusiasm. I think the Arab Spring could well turn into the winter of our discontent. And it may not turn out as optimistically as people hope, and I'll go into detail in a minute. The second thing is the expansion and the rise of Iran. One of the saddest things about our involvement in Iraq is what it did was take the country which was the balance to Iran and remove it as far as an important and powerful balance to Iran. So Iran is looking at the Arab Spring, the weakness that they perceive in Iraq, and thinking this is their moment. And they're going to expand. They've already started expanding. They're going to expand not only in the region, but they're going to start wreaking havoc, I think, throughout the world, Latin America as well as in the United States. And we just saw last week with the terror plots against the Israeli and the Saudi ambassador in Washington. The third thing I think is going to happen is an encirclement of Israel. And that has started. It will increase. The Arab Spring contributes to that, as does the rise of Iran. Those are the 3 areas around the world where whatever happens in them is going to affect us directly. And it's going to affect us with things like, what if we're faced with a choice? Do we supply Israel with weapons? Do we stand by Israel? Do we do potentially something militarily on the side of Israel? Or do we step back and let time take its course? The next thing will be Iran. If Iran gets dominance of the Persian Gulf region, 40% of the world's exported oil goes through there. And if Iran decides to flip the switch on, flip the switch off, when you go to gas up, you're going to find a very different world. When you go to the grocery store to check out, you're going to find food prices that are going to shock you. The third thing is the Arab Spring, and what does that portend? So let me go back and start with that and then work my way through in more detail. The Arab Spring started out very optimistically, and it was the forces of democracy and reform. Every one of the countries, whether it was Tunisia or Libya or Egypt or Jordan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, each one of these countries has its own dynamic. Tolstoy once said about families, he said, every happy family has the same story. Every unhappy family has its own story. Well, every one of these unhappy countries in the Middle East has its own story. But they have 2 things in common, every one of them. They have huge youth populations. In some cases, 70-75% of the population of these countries is under the age of 30, under the age of 35. And in almost all of these countries, those kids don't have jobs. and there are no economic prospects for them on the horizon. So that's a revolution that's waiting to happen. It was going to happen eventually. Nobody was sure what the ignition would be, what would ignite that revolution, but it has now started. And that's probably okay. What's not okay is the rapidity with which it's happened and the instability that it's caused in the region. So, for example, Egypt, which is the leading country in that part of the world. It has one of the largest populations. It's got the longest history. This is a country where for 5,000 years they've been governed by pharaohs, kings, and dictators, and maybe generals. They have never had self-rule and self-government. So the road to that is going to be rocky. And we are seeing, in fact, that it is very rocky. There will be elections of some sort in the fall, and it's very likely that an Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood candidates will win. Now, who are they? Why do we care? Well, the Muslim Brotherhood has been around since the 1920s, and that's the mothership for al-Qaeda. That's the mothership for Islamic Jihad. That's the group that is closely connected to and tied with Hamas on the Gaza Strip. These guys are not good guys. Now, they're going to say they're good guys, but they're not. They have a long history of violence. They have not said we're not going to, but they've said we're going to think we want to achieve victory through the ballot box. But these are guys who are not going to be content with a democratic country. In Egypt, they will want an Islamic state. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because what Egypt does, a lot of the other countries in the region will then do as they try to transition. So democracy sounds good, but it's not good if it's one man, one vote, one time. And that's the worry, that that's the direction Egypt goes in, and then that will be the direction of the other countries in the region. To go to Iran and what's happening in Iran. Now, Iran didn't start the Arab Spring. They claim they started it, but they didn't start it. In fact, when there was a reform movement in Iran 2 years ago after the Iranian election, we, the United States, did not encourage it. Just the opposite. Obama thought he was going to be able to negotiate with the Iranians, and so didn't want to ruin that opportunity that he thought he had by saying and supporting the Iranian reform movement. So what's happened? Well, in Iran, all those reformers are now in jail. And Iran is looking around at the Arab Spring and saying, there's a parade going, I got to get to the front of it to lead it. They're trying to feel, is there any way they can exploit this and get to, and become the sort of leaders of this movement? Nobody in the Middle East really believes that, but what they're using that as an excuse to expand. Now, what are they doing expansively? In the last 3 or 4 months, they've had Iranian warships that have gone out of the Persian Gulf, which is where they have always been. They've gone around Saudi Arabia. They've gone through the Suez Canal along the side of Egypt because there's no government in Egypt to stop them now. And they've gone into the Mediterranean to encircle Israel in a very provocative way. They sailed back to Iran, but they wanted to make the point that they could reach in to the Mediterranean and they could encircle Israel. The other thing Iran has done is they've clicked away and they're continuing with their nuclear weapons programs. Everybody's worried about the Arab Spring and Israeli-Palestinian peace. The Iranians are slowly but surely enriching uranium. They're slowly but surely testing missiles to carry a nuclear warhead. And they are, they're on their road to becoming a nuclear weapons state. The third thing they're doing is they support terrorist groups throughout the region. Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Hamas on the Gaza Strip, both of those surround Israel. They get their money and sustenance from Iran. The other country that Iran is very active in supporting is Syria. Again, Syria is in the middle of its Arab Spring moment, Arab Spring nightmare more like, and Iran is one of their strongest supporters. So Iran sees its position in the region as expanding. They're expanding to surround Israel with their allies in Lebanon and in Syria and on the Gaza Strip. They're trying to foment problems by injecting themselves into the Arab Spring movement in Egypt and in other countries. And they're also they're taking on a much more belligerent tone. I mean, they frequently say things like, we want to have 2 nuclear weapons, one for Israel and the second one is for America. They frequently say things like we want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth and we want to take America off the map. Now, who cares what they say? But it's what they're able to do. Iran's nuclear weapons program continues apace. Now, to have a nuclear weapon one that you really could be delivered. You have to have three things. You need enriched uranium. That's the fuel for a nuclear weapon. You need a missile that can deliver it. You can't just sort of drive a nuclear weapon on the back of a truck and drop it off. It has to go in a submarine or a missile or an airplane. So Iran is testing medium-range and long-range missiles that can reach Europe and ultimately potentially the United States. They're not there yet, but they have tested successfully missiles that could go from Iran to reach Europe. The third thing you need is the blueprint that pulls all that together, that figures out how to make the nuclear explosion work adequately, how it can be sort of put on top of the missile, how it can be delivered. We know that they've gotten a lot of that from a Pakistani nuclear scientist, A.Q. Khan. So we know Iran, we know what we see. Iran is well on its way to becoming a nuclear weapons power. What concerns me about the expansion of Iran is if they are this brazen without nuclear weapons, how are they going to be if they have nuclear weapons, and if they are, at least for a while, the only country in that part of the world with nuclear weapons? The next thing is going, though, is Iran's nuclear weapons program. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, say anywhere from 6 months to 5 years from now, what will happen to that part of the world? Well, every other country is going to say, we need ours. Saudi Arabia has already said if Iran gets nukes, we're getting nukes. Egypt, although they're in a little disarray right now, they would be a potential country to go nuclear. So would Turkey. So you could start seeing an arms race in the single scariest part of the world, but this time it's a nuclear arms race. And once you start having that many nuclear weapons awash in a region that's that unstable, at some point one of them is either going to go off or one of them is going to find its way into the hands of terrorists. The third thing is when I talked about the encirclement of Israel. Now, I've mentioned this before, but when President Obama went to the UN a year ago, he said to the Palestinians, he said, I want to welcome the nation of Palestine into the United Nations a year from now. So fast forward to last month. Well, there's no state of Palestine. Okay, they haven't figured out how to do it. Their negotiations with Israel have broken down. The president has been unable to get those negotiations started, despite the fact that Hillary said that it was only going to take a year. Well, so here we are with a very disappointed Palestinian population. And again, Palestine, like all those other countries, has a very large youth population without jobs. So you're going to see an escalation of tensions between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think it will increase in the next 6 months as the Palestinian youth say, wait, Obama told us a year ago we could have a country. The UN wants to vote statehood for us in some fashion, and we don't have it. They're waking up every morning and saying nothing's changed. We don't have any jobs. We don't have our own country, and that breeds frustration. So I think what will start as peaceful demonstrations along the Israeli-Palestinian borders, somebody will start throwing rocks. And then it'll start escalating, and then Israel will defend itself. And you could see a war starting that nobody wants, but that it starts nonetheless. And once that were to start escalating, then you have all the other countries around Israel who have their own problems, who want to divert attention from their own problems. So that you have, on the north of Israel, you have Lebanon. Southern Lebanon is controlled by the terrorist group Hezbollah. They've already started making trouble on that northern border. They're going to see a golden moment to let's make a little more trouble. Why? Because they want to divert attention from the fact that they've just murdered the previous prime minister and the UN has indicted them for it. Then you have Syria. Well, we all know about the problems in Syria, right? They're murdering people every day. They definitely want to divert attention to their problems. So they're going to try to rally their people if there's any kind of violence in the Middle East to say, look at our enemy, Israel. It's all Israel's fault. So that they are hoping that the world stops paying attention to what they're doing to their own people, and they hope they're going to rally all of their own people. So then you have the two countries on the north of Israel deciding they want to join whatever fight starts. And then on the south of Israel is the Sinai Peninsula, where Egypt is. Well, we all know that Egypt is going through its own throes with democracy, but we know that that's on the Sinai Peninsula, which has been peaceful for 30 years, and a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. There is violence that has started, and it's Islamic jihadist violence. So you could see a situation that, again, nobody really wants, but could well happen a year from now, where violence between Israel and the Palestinians starts, and then it starts bringing in the entire region. So those are the three, I think, trouble spots that we have to watch out for. Now, you'll notice what I've not mentioned. I've not mentioned Afghanistan and Iraq. I think there are problems there, a lot of problems. But I don't think they're necessarily going to be a direct threat to us as these others would be. Afghanistan is going to wind down. I think it's going to go very badly at the end because while we've been successful militarily on the ground, we've been unable to do the two things that will let those victories on the ground be sustainable, and that's we've been unable to get rid of the sanctuaries that the Taliban and al-Qaeda use in Pakistan and the corrupt and incompetent Karzai government. So it's like a three-legged stool in Afghanistan. We've been successful militarily with the U.S. surge, but no matter how strong that leg of the stool is, if the other two are weak, that stool doesn't sit. And the Karzai government, 10 years later, they're still corrupt and incompetent. They're not going to wake up tomorrow and change. And the third thing is Pakistan. And we've seen, especially recently, that Pakistan is becoming more of a failed state than it ever was. We realize now that Pakistan had been hiding bin Laden in plain sight in more or less a safe house for the last 10 years. So Pakistan isn't going to help us get rid of the safe sanctuaries. So no matter what happens, I think you have an Afghanistan that ends badly. Iraq, we're leaving Iraq. Again, I don't think these are national security interests that are going to affect the price of bread in the United States. But Iraq could well go pretty well. It will have a certain, we got to take the training wheels off the bike at some point, and we're taking the training wheels off. Iraq is going to teeter. May fall, may not, but we've done our best. The other thing, though, and the other country that I've not mentioned as a vital interest of the United States is Libya. Now, we've been at war for Libya since March. And if anybody remembers when President Obama came to announce the Libyan war, he said it's going to be days, not weeks. It's not been weeks, it's been months. And it may end up being years. We still can't find Gaddafi. I personally don't care where Gaddafi is. Somebody will eventually find him, they'll mutilate him, they'll hang him upside down. What I care about are Gaddafi's weapons of mass destruction. And we should have known in March, and I and others, particularly at my mothership, Fox News, we have been warning about this from the very beginning. Gaddafi has nuclear weapons materials. He probably has some radiological materials lying around. We know he has mustard gas, and we know he had what are called man-pads and shoulder-fired missiles that can take down, say on the edge of an airport, they can take down helicopters, they can take down civilian aircraft. Somehow, the United States, in our zeal to do days, not weeks in Libya, forgot the fact that if Gaddafi and his pals and his army melted away, there was going to be nobody guarding those weapons caches throughout the country, and that they were very valuable. And indeed, some of that stuff has started making its way into the international black market. Now, who buys on the international black market? Bad guys. Terrorists buy on the international black market. So while the fate of Libya, I don't think is a vital interest to the United States, I think the fate of Libya's weapons of mass destruction could well be. Now, those are the immediate problems we have. In the longer range, I think we've got several things that we're not paying enough attention to. One is the rise of China. Well, everybody knows it's going to happen, but nobody knows what to do about it. But that will mean a more sustained naval presence in the Pacific. And in an era of defense budget cuts, people really want to cut defense, and boy, the Navy's a big pile. So watch and see what happens to that. If we start reducing our military, particularly our Navy, we are then giving China a free rein through a part of the world where it wants to expand. The next thing, and the one that I think most people have the hardest time trying to figure out, is cyber. The military, the Pentagon has finally stood up what's called a cyber command. And that means, we have the Pacific Command, we have the Atlantic Command, we have the Africa Command. We now have the Cyber Command. And their job is to create an offensive cyber weapons capability so it would deter anybody who wanted to use theirs. That's good. But their defensive capability is to defend the U.S. military and defense contractors. But guess where the real threat from cyber is going to be? It's going to be when you go to the ATM machine and you don't have an account. It's when you go turn on the water tap and the city's water supply, which is done through the internet and through software programs, it doesn't work. So cyber, to me, the biggest problem with cyber is that it threatens the civilian economy. And we have no defense against it. And we are the most vulnerable country on the planet to cyber attacks. Why? Because we don't get through 5 minutes of our day without using email or internet. You can't, the water supply is all done by software programs done over the internet. Your banking system is all done over the internet. We communicate with each other over the internet. If somehow the internet isn't working, or there's some kind of an attack against computer systems in this country, we don't make it till tomorrow before we have massive social unrest. So to me, that's the longer range problem. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but I think it's a problem on the horizon that we need to start thinking about. The same way we need to start thinking about not cutting the defense budget and particularly our Pacific presence.
Right, and they were out in Times Square, and they were protesting how bad Israel was doing these horrible things to Palestinians. They can't get supplies, can't get food, all this stuff. Yeah. And I didn't really know how to counter any of that because I'm really not educated. So for those of us that don't have all your experience in foreign policy, can you give us a little just rundown briefly?
Sure. What this is Israel has a blockade of the Gaza Strip. Now, if you think of a map, think of like a peanut, peanut in its shell. So it's fat on the top, fat on the bottom, skinny in the middle. In the middle of the peanut, Israel's the peanut. In the middle of the peanut, on the right side, is the west bank of the Jordan River. Those are the Palestinians who, in fact, are negotiating. On the left side of the peanut's middle is the Gaza Strip. And that's also Palestinian, but they had an election, a one-man, one-vote, one-time election about 2 years ago, where they elected Islamic jihadists to run their government. And they've elected Hamas, which is a terrorist group, and they're running the Gaza Strip. Now, when Israel, for the last several years, there have been going across the two sides of the peanut, going in the middle, have been Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza were moving freely back and forth to Israel. In fact, most of the jobs were in Israel. But what was happening was school buses were getting bombed, shopping centers were getting bombed, innocent civilians were getting killed, and missiles were coming in. So Israel built walls through that middle part of the peanut. And what they also did was on the Gaza Strip, which borders the Mediterranean, they put like a blockade, a flotilla out there, so no ships could go directly from wherever into the Gaza Strip because the ones that were going were carrying weapons. So that's called the blockade. Now, Syria, which is north of Israel, they wanted to break the Gaza blockade, and that's the objective of Hamas and of the more radical groups in the Middle East. They want to break that blockade. So what they did was they sent a ship through that was loaded with teddy bears and baby formula and diapers, I think Pampers, and stuff that was, it tugs at your heart, right? And they sent that through, and Israel, as Israel does, boards every ship. And when Israel sees that it's Pampers and teddy bears, they usually let the ship through. If it isn't Pampers and teddy bears, they divert it. They won't let the ship through. Well, the ship turned out to have Pampers and teddy bears, but it also had about 20 guys on the ship with knives and guns and long metal things. And so when the Israelis boarded the ship, they fought. And Israel overreacted. So Israel was taking the hits, taking the blows, and they fired back and people died. So the world then says, it's like a sucker punch. Israel fell for the sucker punch. So the world says, the Israelis are killing people who are just trying to bring Pampers and baby formula into the Gaza Strip, where the worry is that what comes next, the next ships, aren't going to have baby formula on them. And so Israel stupidly overreacted. The world then criticizes Israel. There have been one or two tests of similar kind of ships that have come through since that incident when you were in New York. Eventually that's going to be a bigger issue than it is now. Right now, those ships are coming from Syria, and Syria's got other problems on its hand. So it's another flotilla to try to challenge the Israelis, at least not now, but I think they will at some point if tensions start heating up. So what you say to people who say to you, how could these terrible Israelis, kill people who are just trying to take teddy bears into children and Gaza, you say, well, they weren't just trying to take teddy bears. They were fighting the Israelis and with lethal force. And the problem with that, breaking that blockade, is the next ship and the next ship are going to have other stuff. They're going to have missiles on them. They're going to have weapons to arm some kind of a, Hamas militant group that's going to attack Israel.
What foreign policy objectives do you think the United States should take against Iran without causing too much of a conflict in the area? Yeah,
it's the single hardest question, and nobody really has a good answer. Iran is building nuclear weapons. Iran is not going to get distracted. Obama offered the hand of friendship, and every time they returned it with, middle finger. So that's not going to work. We've tried sanctions, and they've actually been some pretty strict sanctions. The problem is nobody else goes along with them. As long as Russia and China want to trade with Iran, and they see it as in their necessity, particularly China gets oil from Iran, Russia sells them natural gas. So they have a dependency relationship on each other, and they're not going to stop it. So what do? Okay, one option, and what you don't want to have happen, which unfortunately I think is what will ultimately happen, is you don't want to be faced with two choices. Bomb Iran or let Iran get the bomb. Because if Iran's going around trying to pop off Israeli and Saudi ambassadors in Washington when they don't have the bomb, can you imagine what they're going to be like when they have nuclear weapons? They'll be really aggressive. So you don't want to ever get to that point. And the great thing when I worked for Kissinger, when I worked for Reagan, is they saw those things on the horizon, and they said, how do we maneuver now so we don't have to get to the point where we have those two lousy choices? Because if you bomb Iran, and I don't know if Heritage has done these think tank sort of simulations, but almost every scenario whereby Iran gets bombed, either by Israel or by us, even if it's Israel that starts the bombing, it very quickly turns into, the United States gets pulled into it. Because, as you said, these are deeply underground. There have been in the past, Iraq, Libya, Syria, have had nuclear weapons programs, but they've all had, their eggs have all been in one basket. They've been in one place and they've been overground. So Israel could bomb them, done, set it back. Iran's got smart. They've learned from that. They put their stuff deep underground with concrete over it so that even with a direct hit, you might not destroy that nuclear centrifuge program. They've also hidden stuff, and they've hidden it, and then they've spread it around the country. So there's not just one place. It's in a lot of places, and guess what their favorite place to put it next to is? Schools, children hospitals, civilian centers. So they know that if anybody bombs them, there'll be large civilian casualties, and then they'll look like the bad guys. So bombing Iran is a lousy option. Okay, letting Iran get the bomb, well, that's a really lousy option, too, because then you have that nuclear arms race in the Middle East. What would you do? I've struggled with this, of how do you get these other countries to go along with saying, I don't think you're going to. China needs energy. They're not going to do any favors for us, especially since they own all of our debt. We're going to do favors for them. They're not going to do favors for us. I think the way to do it is economically. When we were in the Reagan administration, what Reagan did, for some of you will remember, others of you will have read about it in the history books. Reagan had two terms. The first term, when we came in the Reagan administration in the beginning, we had a weak hand to play. Our military was greatly diminished. We had ships that couldn't sail. We weren't paying our people enough. We had a hollowed-out military force, so we couldn't even do a rescue operation to the American diplomats who had been kidnapped in Tehran. So Reagan spent the first 4 years building up the defenses, United States defenses, because at the same time we were cutting our stuff back, the Soviets were building. So Reagan wanted to build up the American defenses. But that wasn't all he wanted to do. He then went around to say, okay, I want to put the chess pieces in place to take down the Soviet Union. He improved relations with our European allies. He told the Eastern Europeans who were under the Iron Curtain, particularly Poland, he said to them, you have the right to demonstrate. You have the right to determine your own destiny. He said that, actually, on the day that he was shot. So I saw the speech that he was giving to the AFL-CIO here in Washington, and he had handwritten in, because it was the beginning of the Polish Solidarity Movement, he had handwritten in saying that you American workers have the right to protest, to determine your own economic destiny. The Poles should too. Reagan was shot. Nobody paid any attention. The one guy who listened was Lech Walesa in Poland, and he said they knew then that America gave them the moral authority. So I would use that same thing that Reagan did, where build up our defenses, make friends with the enemies, to give encouragement to the enemies, make friends with the friends, or improve relations with the friends. But then Reagan did two other things. He realized that the Soviet Union was completely dependent upon high oil prices. They didn't export anything. Who was buying Russian cars, right? Nobody. Who was buying Russian Nobody. The only thing anybody was buying was Russian energy, particularly Russian oil. And he knew that in the 1970s and early 1980s, the Russians were using that money of high oil prices, and they were spending a lot on social programs and on their military. So if you reduce the price of oil, they're broke. And that's what he did. Now, the world was in an economic slump, so there was a lot of extra oil. But Reagan sent his deputy CIA director, General Vernon Walters, to Saudi Arabia and said, look, we think it's a really good idea, even though the price of oil is low, we want to make it lower. And if you will just flood the world with oil. The price of oil went from $30 a barrel, which sounds like just a fiction, doesn't it? $30 a barrel to $10 within a matter of months. Well, what happened? The Soviet Union was broke. And they knew they were broke. They weren't making, they were making cars, they weren't making electronics, they were exporting oil. And oil just all of a sudden fell by 2/3. So their revenues were down. They couldn't even, they knew they were not going to be able to do all these social programs, which kept their people quiet and happy. And then Reagan did the coup de grace, which is he said, Star Wars. He said, we have this great plan to build a defensive weapons shield, and it's going to take a lot of fancy, expensive new technology. So there, you try to match that. And they couldn't. And so the Russians knew at that point, and Gorbachev has even said in his memoirs, once the Star Wars program got proposed, they knew that the game was up. And that's when you started seeing the disintegration of the Soviet Union. I think that's how we should do it with Iran. I would, right now, go to the Saudis, who are feeling a little angry, right? I mean, the favorite son was just about popped off at a Washington restaurant. I would go to the Saudis and say, look, we're in this together. None of us want to see Iran rising. Why don't you flood the world with oil? It's going to drive down the price. The world economy, which is not so good, is to our advantage because the price of oil is relatively low from where it should be. So if you see the price of oil going down, what are you going to start seeing in Tehran? You're going to see a lot of unhappy young people without jobs, right? And so what's going to happen to them? Then they hopefully do what the Soviet Union did, which is they then demand a change. Now, the other thing you can do is the other economic weapon. We've had sanctions, but again, the Chinese and Russians don't abide by them. But what we could do is what Senator Mark Kirk, anybody here work for Mark Kirk? Follow this guy. He is so terrific. He has proposed, he's the guy who took Obama's seat from Illinois. He's a new senator. He's a Navy officer, has fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Anyway, Mark Kirk is leading a group in the Senate to bankrupt the Central Bank of Iran. Now, it's a little weedy, but let me explain. If you buy or sell stuff in the world market, it's done in dollars. So if Iran sells oil to anybody, they pay for it in dollars. And those dollars have to go to an American bank, right? We control the American banks. So if Iran wants to sell oil, if anybody wants to buy oil, they have to do it through dollars. And they do it, and we've tried shutting down parts of it, but there's one great big place that does all those deals, and that's the Iranian Central Bank. If we just put them on the list of, you guys don't get to do business with American banks, it doesn't matter so much. Nice if China went along, it'd be nice if Russia went along, but we could do it ourselves. We could throw their currency into chaos. Now that's, they're not going to be happy about that. And they've said already that, they'll think of that as an act of war. But they're going to be really pretty busy trying to deal with their own population. So I say, don't bomb Iran. Don't let Iran get the bomb. But do what Reagan did and bankrupt them. And do it fast. The other thing to do, now does everybody know what Stuxnet is? Stuxnet, the first cyber missile ever created. And we don't know who did it, but I'll tell you who I think did it. Iran has centrifuge programs, and you know this spin cycle on your dryer where you throw off the water and you get the dry clothes in the middle? Well, that's what a nuclear reactor is. It spins off, and in the center it's concentrated enriched uranium. And so all the scientists who were going to their nuclear weapons reactor enrichment programs, all these guys in Iran, were looking at the computer screen. It looked like everything was going great. But there was a worm, a virus in the computer system, which they didn't realize. And all of a sudden, they thought everything was just going great. And then it turns out it wasn't going great. That the centrifuges were spinning too fast, like your dryer goes too fast. And the whole thing was, collapsing. They finally found it out because they went to, what's the one? What's the, not McAfee, but what's the cyber defense? When you get the software for Symantec. They'd gone to Symantec, and all of a sudden Symantec was noticing that there were a lot of scientists in Iran asking if anybody knew about a virus. And so they didn't realize it until we didn't realize that they realized it until they came onto the international software market. And so we realized that they had a problem. They realized they had a problem. Now, eventually they fixed all the computers, but it's set them back several years. Now, who did that? Who created that worm? Chances are it was not some 17-year-old guy in Granny's basement eating cold Chinese food in his Spider-Man pajamas. Chances it was sufficiently sophisticated that it was probably a country that did that. It probably needed a major infrastructure. Which countries are capable of doing it? Several. United States, Israel, which has a great high-tech program. Who has the incentive to do it? The United States and Israel. Who's claimed credit for it? Nobody. Who do I think did it? The United States and Israel. But that's the kind of war, that's asymmetrical warfare. That's like thinking outside the box. That's how do we get to them when they're really vulnerable. Now, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to get angry. They're going to go to Symantec. They're going to hope for better, virus software programs, but they're not going to bomb over that. So I think the more we can use either the economic weapon or the cyber stuff, which we're very good at. I mean, we're very vulnerable to, but we're very good at, the better. And I think that what we want to avoid, though, is to get to the point 2 years from now when it's bomb Iran, let Iran get the bomb. You know what? This is something that George Bush has gotten no credit for. But in fact, he had a very proactive program in Africa, and it was a lot of not sort of foreign assistance giveaway stuff, but it was a lot of medical things, AIDS eradication programs, and he got very little credit for it. The thing about Africa is the Chinese, as you say, are there, and our problem with it is when we give foreign aid, we have so many strings attached. So if I talked to someone who was from Liberia and said, who do you do business with? And they said, well, we have a choice. The Americans come in and they want to build a refinery or they want to get involved with our oil business, but it takes about 5 years between when we start talking and when we certify that there's no child labor and we certify that there are no blood diamonds and we certify, no birds are getting killed. And then by the end, maybe 5 years later, or the Chinese come to us and they say, we don't care. We just want to build that, and they'll build it within 6 months. And so in 6 months, we can have our people have jobs. And so the Chinese, as much as they are ruthlessly blind to whatever the problems of these countries in Africa, they, in fact, are giving jobs to the African people. So when I asked this woman, diplomat, I said, who would you rather do business with? Thinking, of course, she's going to say the most wonderful United States. We'd rather do business with the Chinese. Because what we need right now is we don't really care about child labor. I mean, we care, but our issues are not child labor. Our issues are not whether we have voting fraud. Our issues are whether our people can eat. And so I think that we have to decide what kind of businessman do we want to be internationally. And I think that the whole notion of do we give countries foreign aid? Do we just give the leaders money? Do we just sort of, if you teach a man to fish, he just feeds himself. If you give him a fish, he's hungry the next day. I think we need to really rethink the whole foreign aid thing of how do we want to do, what kind of an influence do we want to have if we want to have an immediate and serious impact. I think that you don't do government-to-government foreign aid. I think you do government-to-individual, micro-lending. Because if you just give foreign aid to the dictators of those countries, it goes to the Swiss bank accounts. They buy weapons, kill a few more of their adversaries, and then you don't help the people. And so what you have is then this spiraling problem in Africa where it's to the extent where it's almost a dead continent. And nobody would be interested except for the fact that they do have the natural resources that you talked about. So I'd rethink not just Africa, but how do we do foreign aid? And the other thing I would rethink is how do we do business overseas? If we're going to keep worrying about certifying whether birds are getting killed when people are starving, we're not going to be very influential in those parts of the world. Okay, the question is about China. What do I think about China, the exchange rate, the issues that we have about China? My old boss, Henry Kissinger, wrote a book called China. Now, it's like that thick. But read reviews of it, but because it's an awfully big book. But what he says, and I think this is very appropriate for how the United States looks at the world and ourselves, we tend to make what I think is the original sin of foreign policy, is we tend to think everybody thinks like us. Everybody wants what we want. Everybody thinks like us. And Kissinger, the opening chapters in this book talk about how the Chinese see the world very differently. We see the world as we want to go reform them. We want to go to Africa and make sure they have a good life. We want to go to China and be missionaries. We want to go to the Middle East and establish democracy. The Chinese don't see things that way. The Chinese have a very different worldview. Their whole, for 4,000 years, their whole modus operandi has been to keep the countries on their periphery fighting with each other, and they think of China as the center of the universe. They also don't think that there's the end of history. We tend to think, once you've solved the problem, you're done. Move on. The Chinese look at something as a solution becomes another problem is created. And so I think one of the problems that we have in dealing with the Chinese, or anybody, is that we have a different worldview, and we have to understand that and take that into account. We look at China, and we think, oh, third world country, poverty, terrible. They look at themselves and thinking, 4,000 years as the center of the universe and a really rotten last 100. And they have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They're angry about what they perceived as the slights they've endured for the last 100 years. So they have a lot to prove to themselves. I think China also has a demographic time bomb that nobody really knows what's going to happen. But the one-child family, particularly with a preference for sons, means that they're now entering an era where the men who are now in their 20s, there's like 120, 125 males for every 100 females. That means there are going to be a lot of males who aren't going to form families. And it's also a society that doesn't encourage, it's very conservative socially. So, they're not going to see gay marriage anytime in Beijing. And they also are a country which really reveres their elderly generation. So you're now going to have one-child family, which means one person is going to be supporting four, parents and grandparents, not going to get married. And so there's a lot of built-in frustration that you can see happening with China. I think China's going to have a very rocky next 10 years, 15 years. What does that mean for us? The Chinese, chip on their shoulder, the Chinese military has had a much bigger role in deciding who the leadership is. That means I think they're going to be more militaristic. I think that the large number of men who aren't going to find partners, that's a lot of testosterone. I've got 3 sons, and I can tell you when boys are not occupied, they're getting in trouble every time. So I worry very much that China is a country which is going to have some problems. Now, how do we deal with that? I think the first and most important thing we could do is stop having China be our banker. You're not going to pick up. Even Hillary says you don't pick a fight with your banker, right? Well, every dollar that we spend, 40 cents is borrowed, and the majority of that, like well over half of that, is borrowed from China. So as long as we're beholden to them to buy our debt, to hold our debt, we're not going to be in a position to do much. The other thing is that China has historically talked about a peaceful rise, but not so peaceful anymore. The Chinese military is definitely rattling their sables. I think that a lot of what we need to do is make sure that we have a strong presence in the Pacific, particularly a strong naval presence, and to realize that the Chinese are going to want to solve their problems peacefully if they can, but they won't necessarily stop with peaceful. But I do think that China's not today's problem. I think that because of the Chinese problems internal to China, we're talking about 10 years out. I don't think it's next week. But China does present a huge cyber threat because they're stealing our stuff like mad.
You haven't talked about Pakistan.
Yeah.
So are they our friend or our enemy?
You know that movie, He's Just Not That Into You? That's Pakistan. They are never going to like us. They see the world differently than we do. We can give them money, we can give them aid, but they're not going to help us. Now, think about, I believe in incentives, whether it's in child rearing or in country managing. What incentives did we give to the Pakistanis? We said to them, we will give you a lot of money if you help us find bin Laden. We will give you an even more amount of money and help you build your military if you will help us kill the Taliban and al-Qaeda. So what did they do? They realized, wait, we're in the hunting bin Laden business. The minute we find him, we're out of business, right? They also thought, you're giving us money for our military to kill, to find al-Qaeda, to find the Taliban. Well, the minute we get rid of them, you're not going to give us any more money, and we need your money because we can't support ourselves. So I think that even though we had the best of intentions, we were dragged around by the nose, and we never really got tough with Pakistan, and we never said, we're willing to go, we're willing to do without you because you're not helping us, you're doing just the opposite. They kept bin Laden alive in a safe house. Why? Because they couldn't afford to have him die of natural causes. So actually there was a Pakistani army liver failure expert who lived in the house next door. So they needed to keep bin Laden alive. They needed to keep him out of sight so that it would look like he was still a threat. And so that's what they did. Now, I think we need to go to Pakistan and say, look, guys, you're just not that into us and we understand. And here's what we're going to do. You have a choice. You can either push the Taliban to negotiate with us, and so there'll be some kind of a negotiated settlement of Afghanistan. And we set that bar really low for what that negotiated settlement is. And if you won't do that, then you have to help us get rid of the safe havens. And if you won't do that, we're out. And we will take the money that we are giving you and we will deploy it elsewhere. We will use it on intelligence in the United States. We will use it for homeland security. And we will use it for special ops because if you become a failed state, we don't want those nukes roaming around the world. And then let Pakistan worry about it. Let the Pakistanis who think that they're going to everybody's going to give them money like the Chinese, they're not going to do that. So I think that the other thing we need to do with Pakistan is make really close friends with India. We had good relations with India. This administration has let that fall, but I think we improve our relations with India. Now, the rationale for Pakistan and Afghanistan was always we needed Pakistan because of the Taliban thing, because of bin Laden, and because we sent our military supplies through Pakistan into Afghanistan. So we needed Pakistan's help with Afghanistan. Now you're going to see increasingly the argument is we need Afghanistan because of Pakistan. Tell me why we need either one. That, by the way, means that the Republican right hates me, the liberal left hates me, because it's very heretical to say I think we need to rethink Pakistan and stop giving them money to behave badly. Okay? Is that it?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have some gifts for you.